Hey lads, welcome to the guide for Halls of Infusion, Mythic Plus guide for Dragonflight Season 2. The footage is from Mythic Plus 0 and I'll be going through the main trash and boss mechanics very quickly with a more detailed guide to follow. One of the most important mobs to pay attention to in the beginning of the dungeons is the Rafty Defenders. They have a couple of mechanics. The first one is a Spear Fury, which is a frontal that you need to avoid, otherwise you're going to get a very nasty bleeding dot on yourself. And they will also cast Demoralizing Shout, which you need to interrupt because if it goes off, you're going to be doing 25% less damage. And it also stacks, so be careful later in the dungeon when you have to pull two of those at the same time. The Geomancers are going to cast Seismic Slam, jumping to a location and doing heavy AoE damage, so make sure to stay out of that. After a couple of packs, you get your first choice in the dungeon. You can go either left or right. Going left gives you engineering buff if you have somebody with that profession in your party, which is basically a cheat death. Going right gives you the option to teleport to bosses if you at some point die in the dungeon, giving you a shortcut. The next mob that deserves our attention is the Containment Apparatus, which is going to target somebody in your party and cast Containment Beam. This one is not interruptible, but you can stun and knock it up to actually stop the cast. This mob also has another spell called Expulse, and you have to interrupt this one because if it goes off, it does heavy AoE damage to everybody in your party. A little bit later on, you have to pull 3 of those at the same time, so be ready to do a lot of stuns for the Containment Beams and be ready to interrupt all of the Expulse casts so you don't wipe. After a few more pulls with various combinations of these mobs, you're going to be at the first boss, Watcher Iridius. He starts at 30% health, but don't be fooled, he has a lot of health to go through, and there are 2 phases of this fight. In phase 1, there are a few mechanics that you need to be aware of. The first one is called Titanic Fist, which is a frontal cast at the tank. You can easily avoid that by sidestepping, but don't get hit because you suffer a lot of damage and you also be stunned. The next mechanic is called Static Surge, which is this channel, does a lot of AoE damage, so healers be prepared to keep everybody topped up. The last important mechanic in phase 1 is called Power Overload. It's going to mark few players in your party, and after a short while they're going to explode and leave a big puddle on the ground that you very quickly need to move away from, because if you stay on top of it, you're going to take a lot of damage. Spark Volley will bombard players with lightning, so make sure you don't stand on the blue circles in the ground, and that will be pretty much everything you're going to see in phase 1, which finishes once the boss reaches 15%. At this point, the boss becomes immune, runs to the middle and starts to channel something called Siphon Power. Your goal is to interrupt that as quickly as possible because for every second that he channels, he's gaining 1% more nature damage, which is eventually going to start one-shotting you if you're not quick enough to interrupt. In order to do that, you have to kill 3 of the 4 orbs that spawn on top of the boss, and this is actually going to blow away his shield and you'll be able to interrupt and continue the fight. The orbs themselves have a cast that does a bunch of damage. It is not interruptible, but you can CC and stun them in order to reduce the incoming damage. Once they reach 0% health, they'll cast a Nullifying Blast. You need to make sure this is on top of the shield, and after 3 blasts, you resume the boss, fighting him the same way as you did in phase 1, but he keeps all the stacks that he gained during the channel phase. That means that he'll be doing a lot more damage than phase 1, so be prepared for that, and you want to blast him down as quickly as possible. If you're saving Bloodlust for him, definitely save it for this phase. Also, keep in mind that the power overload circles that you're going to be living on the ground are now much bigger than before, so make sure that you're spread and you have enough space to kite the boss outside of them. After you kill the boss, you have another left or right choice. If you go right, it's a little bit shorter, but the trash is nastier. And if you go left, it's a little bit longer with easier trash. And if you have an herbalist in your group, you should go this way because you can get an extra buff. They can activate one of the mushrooms shortly after going this way, and this will give you a buff that removes 1 poison or disease effect every 15 seconds. As we're going to find out shortly, this could be very useful for what's to follow. No matter which way you go, you're going to encounter some shock troopers which have a tank buster. They're also going to cast Elemental Focus, and if that cast goes off, the next time they do the tank buster, they're going to hit everybody in your party, not just the tank, so make sure to interrupt that. If you fail to do so, you can also purge it. Next we have the Swoglights, which you're going to see on the boss as well. These mobs are going to fixate somebody on your party, start hitting them and applying a debuff, poison debuff, which is stacking. If you get 10 stacks, you're dead, no matter what. So make sure to track that, make sure to dispel if you get close, and here that Herbalism Mushroom buff could be very useful. Slowing, stunning, and CCing these mobs, killing them from range is crucial so you don't get deaths in the trash. You're also going to encounter some Dragonflights which have a frontal called Dazzle. You can either sidestep this or maybe just don't stand in front of them, because if you get hit, you'll take a bunch of damage and you will be disoriented. In this area there are several Zealots which are invisible and they will stun you if they hit you first, but you can use AoE abilities to actually get the first hit and avoid the stun. However, they get a stacking increasing buff, so the longer they are alive, the more damage they're going to do, and you might want to prio kill this so they don't become unkillable, or maybe you just start kiting them if you get to that point. Shortly after, you're going to reach 2 mini-bosses that you need to kill in order to open the way. The first one is called Amy, and it's going to be casting this burst that you can interrupt as much as possible, but make sure to save a kick for the more important one, which is called Cauterize. Cauterize is a healing one, and if it goes off, of course, it's going to top up the mini-boss. She's also going to do Molten Subduction, which leaves a big fire patch on the ground. Definitely don't stay on top of that. And that brings our attention to the second mini-boss, which is called Sierra. She's going to cast Whirlwind Fury, which is this big white AoE on the ground that you need to avoid, and that also spawns all the Zergling adds that the tank needs to get aggro on, and then you just AoE down. Pretty simple. After you kill the mini-bosses, you're at the second boss, the Gulping Goliath Big Frog Thingy. As promised earlier, its overpowering ability is going to spawn few brown circles on the ground, and after they hit, and you avoid them of course, they're going to spawn our favorite Swoglets, which are going to fixate on people, apply the poison debuffs, and if you get 10, you're dead. The other important mechanic is called Gulp, and this is this big green circle around the boss, which you might think you want to avoid, but you actually want to leave the tank inside. If nobody is standing in, the boss becomes big red and enrages, starting doing more damage, so you want to avoid this, but it also kills the small Swoglets, so if you can time the Swoglets to be inside of the circle once it explodes, then you can get rid of them very quickly and effectively. Keep in mind that whoever stays inside of the circle takes a big amount of damage, and they also get 3 stacks of the poison applied to them, so you have to be very careful not to kill somebody, especially the tank. The boss also has a toxic cast, which does heavy AoE damage to the whole party, so make sure you're prepared for that with defensives and a lot of healing. And over here you can see how the gulp looks like once it eats the tank. Other than that, the boss is going to jump into ranged people every now and then, so make sure to avoid the big brown circles on the ground, rinse and repeat, and eventually you're going to go to the next part of the dungeon. The trash here introduces few new mobs. The first one is called the Earthshaker, which is going to do a cast with a big brown circle around it. Make sure you're not standing inside because you're going to take a bunch of damage and you will get stunned. The dragon is going to do a frontal called Oceanic Breath. Make sure you're not standing in front of him. And he also has a nasty AoE group-wise ability called Deep Chill, which hits and slows everybody. Last but not least, we have the Ice Colors, which have this non-interruptible refreshing tight cast, which is a heal and you have to stun or CC it in order for it not to go off. Few packs of those and you're at boss number 3, Kajin, who has this aura that constantly does damage, so healers be prepared for that. Of course, there are some mechanics to be involved here as well. The first one is called Frost Cyclone, which is going to target somebody and fire a frontal at them. Make sure you don't get hit and make sure not to aim it at the little pillars that you're going to see in just a second. The next mechanic is Glacial Surge, which is pretty similar to Kurok in their last raid. It's going to spawn a circle around the boss, which explodes shortly after, and then concentrated circles are going to move outwards. Make sure you don't get hit by any of them. The last mechanic is called Hailstorm. Once that happens, you need to hide behind one of the pillars around. If you fail to do so, you'll probably get one-shotted. And keep in mind that the frontal we saw earlier could actually kill those pillars as well, so make sure that you stay away from them if Hailstorm is not going on. Rinse and repeat, kill the boss, and on to the next. What follows next is a gauntlet with some of the mobs that we have already seen, and a new one called Aqua Rager. This one is going to cast Boiling Rage, which is going to buff it, so interrupt if you can or suit otherwise. And once it gets low, it will cast Tidal Diversions. Make sure to interrupt this long cast, because if it succeeds, it's going to split the mobs into new ones, which you have to kill again. At all times, there will be waves coming at you from left and right from the far end of the screen. Make sure to dodge them, and if you're close to one of the pillars, you can actually hide behind it to avoid the waves. Your goal is to reach the end of the gauntlet and kill a mini-boss there, which is going to cost Aqua's Barrier. Make sure to interrupt it or at least purge the shield if it goes off. The other cast, unfortunately, is not interruptible. Inundate is AoE group-wide damage, so be prepared to heal that up. And lastly, Flash Flood is a big AoE on the ground, just move away from that. Once you kill the mini-boss, the gauntlet is over and you are at the Primal Tsunami, the last boss. His Tempest Fury is AoE group damage, so be prepared to heal that up. And he's also going to be casting Infused Globals. Those are the circles on the ground that you need to avoid because they will not only hurt you, but they will also slow you down, making it hard to avoid other mechanics. He also has a tank buster called Buffet. It's going to knock the tank back and then channel a beam to him, which is also going to do heavy group AoE damage, so again, be prepared to heal that up. At 100 energy, the boss starts phase 2 and he sends you back to the gauntlet, but this time there is no mobs there. Instead, you have to very quickly navigate between some of the globals that you saw in phase 1 and the waves that are still coming at you from the bottom of the screen. You can still hide behind the pillars if they're free, and any kind of movement ability or even immunes are going to make it faster to the middle. Once you get there, there's 4 mobs which are channeling to the boss and you want to interrupt them as quickly as possible because they're buffing the boss and he's going to be doing more damage once he comes back. If you interrupt the mobs, they're going to cast the Inundate, which is that AoE from the mini-boss that we saw earlier. This is not interruptible, but you can stun and CC the mobs to reduce the amount of incoming damage. Once you kill all 4 adds, the boss comes back and phase 1 starts again, but now he's going to be doing a little bit more damage based on the fact how quickly you managed to interrupt the adds during the transition. The fight continues, altering between phase 1 and phase 2 until you manage to finally kill the boss and finish Halls of Infusion. I hope that this short guide is useful to you and it's going to help you in your Mythic Plus runs next week when this is actually live on the servers. I have more short guides for the rest of the dungeons just like this one, so feel free to subscribe to the channel and I will be having more in-depth guides coming for each of the dungeons into the future. So I'll catch you there, thanks for watching and see you in Azeroth.